Active transport, passive transport, no energy. Active transport, energy must be used. Passive transport, you start out with a. My dog is here. Get down, dummy. Active, right there, active. All right, so passive transport, things go from a high concentration to a low concentration. They do it automatically, no energy is spent. Active transport is when you move a solute from a low concentration to a high concentration. It doesn't want to go there. It doesn't do that automatically. It doesn't take any energy to fall down the mountain, but it takes energy to climb up the mountain, to climb that concentration gradient, to go from where there's a lot of solute, say salt, over to a spot where there's to go from a spot where there's very little salt to a spot where there's a bunch of salt. Those salt molecules would have to travel against the gradient. They're not going to do that on their own. You have to spend energy. One way that happens is through molecular transport, sometimes simply called active transport. What this is there is a protein in the cell membrane that's literally pumping. And what it's doing is it's spending energy to suck something into the protein and then spit it out in the cell, or to suck something from the inside of the cell into the protein and spit it out to the area outside of the cell. The thing that makes it active transport, the reason it has to spend energy, is because it's pumping against the gradient. So for instance, if there's a lot of sodium inside the cell and a little bit of sodium outside the cell, but the cell needs more sodium. In order to get sodium from the area around it, the outside, into the inside, the cell membrane, a protein on it, has to expend energy to literally suck the sodium out of the outside environment and then spit it into the cell. It's going against the gradient. Great example of the way this works is with fish. That fish need to be actively fighting against a freshwater environment they're in. That if a fish is in freshwater, the only way it can get oxygen and expel carbon dioxide is by running that water over their gills. When they run that water over their gills, they're literally running it over flesh that has a lot of veins and arteries in it. That's very much more like the inside of an organism. It isn't covered in scales. It isn't waterproof. So there would be a possibility there of the salt leaving the inner tissues of the fish and heading out into the water. And the way it would tend to move for passive transport is from the high concentration of salt in the fish to the low concentration of salt in the water. So the fish has to practice, the cells on the fish's gills have to practice active transport to keep pulling that salt back into the cell instead of just allowing it to leave. Active transport. Another type of active transport has to do with moving big packages. It's called bulk transport. Comes in two types. You got your endocytosis and your exocytosis. Endocytosis is the hug of death. It's the hug of death because what's going on is that the cell literally wraps around something, pulls it into itself, and then it goes through the membrane into the cell. Exocytosis, exit, spitting out, is when the cell literally covers something in a vesicle inside the cell, like say a protein. That vesicle, that little piece of membrane, joins with the actual cell membrane and then opens up and sends that big bulk protein out. Exocytosis is basically the cell opening the membrane and letting out something that it doesn't want to keep anymore. Endocytosis is the cell wrapping around something and sucking it in. Another way that we deal with that is that endocytosis, when it's bringing in something solid, some kind of solid food, it's called phagocytosis, from the Greek word that has to do with food. If it's bringing in a liquid, it's called penocytosis, from the Greek word for drink. So the cell is literally eating and drinking through endocytosis.